All right. Seems like folks have shown up, and I'm excited for the talk today. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Ben Halpern. I'm the executive director here at NCEAS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and we're super excited to be launching I think it's our fifth, maybe sixth annual seminar series that we do in the spring to kind of bring new voices and elevate different perspectives into the conversation about ecology, environmental science, and data science, and the intersection of these important issues. So just before we get started, I wanted to just give you a little bit of context of NCEAS in case you are new to the center and what we do here. We've been around for 31 years now, and we really try to bring together people, ideas, data, knowledge, information to leverage that to accelerate insight and solutions into environmental problems. So we do that by bringing teams of people together here at the center. We host a lot of early career researchers here at the center to work on projects. We build data tools and cyber infrastructure to support that work. And we provide opportunities to learn how to better use those tools, as well as supporting convenings and gatherings like this one that help build bridges across communities and widen the umbrella, the tent to the community that's engaged in the work we do here. So in that vision and mission, this seminar series has been a really exciting way that we can bring people together and hear some new ideas and new voices. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin, who's going to introduce our speaker, and really excited to hear what she has to say. So turn it over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Ben. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our sixth annual NC Spring Seminar Series. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Abre Connor, our first speaker in the series centered around the theme of environmental data science and its impacts on communities and ecosystems. I'm Justin Cotty, a data coordinator at NCEAS, and I'm joined by the rest of the seminar series planning committee, Angie, Sophia, Erica, LM, Rachel, and Nicole. Before we begin, we ask you to join us in acknowledging the Chumash peoples, who are the environmental stewards of the land on which NCEAS is located. We pay our respects to the Chumash peoples and their elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. We acknowledge this land on which we live and work is the traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples, including the Chumash peoples. This land today is the result of the erasures and exclusions of Indigenous peoples, and as we come together to bring awareness to the issues of equity and justice, we recognize that the Chumash people and so many other Indigenous people are still fighting to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism in their tribal territories. Now, to get into the talk, please feel free to add any questions you may have during the talk through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll have a moderated Q&A by Erica at the end of the presentation. And now I'm delighted to welcome Abre Connor to our seminar series. Abre is an environmental justice and civil rights attorney at the director of the Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at the NAACP. She oversees the strategy and collaboration across the NAACP to dismantle environmental racism. She also leads the association's Stop Dirty Data campaign and started the association's first climate film and storytelling program, Climate in Color, among other work within her center. She has taught education law and the Environmental Policy Clinic in the Environmental Policy and Management program at the University of California, Davis. Before joining the Law Foundation, Abre was a staff attorney with the ACLU Foundation of Northern California, where she advocated for the civil rights and liberties of Central Valley and Northern California residents, including an emphasis on issues that impact people of color in rural communities such as environmental justice. As a staff attorney at the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment in Delano, California, Abre primarily worked with migrant farm workers and in unincorporated communities. She has worked at numerous civil rights entities, including the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, and Capitol Hill. She was also an associate in the White House Office of Presidential Personnel in the Obama administration. She currently sits on the ABA's Board of Governors, Earth Justice's Board of Trustees, and was appointed to the EPA's first HBCU MSI Advisory Council. A graduate of American University, Washington College of Law, and the University of Florida, Abre has been named a top 40 under 40 nation's best advocate by the National Bar Association, 40 under 40 alumni by the University of Florida, 40 under 40 young gifted and green recipient, and has been featured in the New York Times' The Daily, Essence, Forbes Magazine, American Bar Association Journal, Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated's National Magazine, Cosmopolitan Magazine, and a 2026 honoree for Time Magazine's The Closers List. Abre, we are so excited to have you. Please take it away.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for having this series and Justin for your coordination and for all the work that you all have done and to Ben as well for ensuring that this series centers many different kinds of voices because I think that's so important, especially when we're talking about data centers and how the impact that it's had on communities. And so, my presentation is really going to focus on what we're seeing, at the ground level and how you can utilize um, working at the community level to ensure that your next steps aren't necessarily policy considerations that don't necessarily include what the community is looking for. And oftentimes, I'm in presentations, I'm in spaces where people are talking about policy considerations when it comes to clean energy or when it comes to water, but they're devoid of the community voice. And so what ends up happening is that we push policy considerations and next steps that don't actually reflect what people want to see. And then they don't work that well because there's not buy-in. And so what I hope to convey by the end of today's presentation is to hopefully help people shift how they think about policy, and that it's not something that is completely devoid of the people who are impacted. So I first wanted to start with, what we're talking about. So when we're talking about AI data centers, it's still interesting to me that there are still some folks who are not necessarily making the connection of how AI actually impacts a physical infrastructure that has to live in somebody's community. And so we're seeing more and more commercials by tech companies. And sometimes I know I have seen it that some of these companies, if you have a certain application, they just add the AI into like an application that you didn't necessarily ask for. Well, all of these requests and everything that happens, there has to be a physical infrastructure that lives, that hosts the requests that are coming in, and that can actually power the actual data center that then allows for you to actually use AI. So, one of the things that was really interesting for us when we first started to see this boom happen, and really it was even before the boom happened, it was when there were just some conversations, was that we noticed that the places where these kinds of considerations were happening were in places where there was already existing industrial build out or there were already environmental justice concerns. And so I was really concerned because as someone who had worked on issues around the height of the fracking boom and around trying to get coal-fired power plants retired in different places across the country, a lot of the strategies and tactics of communicating what this was going to mean for communities felt very similar to what we were hearing about untested energy solutions from the past. And so I wanted to make sure that number one, we weren't going to end up in a place that we did see with fracking, right? Which was that the community was saying, very near the beginning when that boom happened, they were saying, we don't want to have this kind of infrastructure just living in our communities. We see that this is going to mean more pollution. We see it's going to mean more problems. So can we make sure that we're building in some kind of structure so that we're not leaving people with the health harms that's going to come from generations to come whenever you have untested energy, quote unquote, solutions that show up? And so it took, I'd say, maybe 7 or 8 years for the reporting and the research to catch up with what communities were actually saying, and the policy considerations as well. And so it was really important for us to get at the forefront of what we were seeing as some of those patterns were to show up. And so, what are some of the considerations? So, data centers, especially hyperscale data centers. So there's a range of data centers. We've had some smaller scale data centers for a long time. Now, hyperscale data centers and the vast needs of what a hyperscale data center needs is very different from like a smaller data center. Um, so imagine, if you had like, well, for those individuals who were around in the earlier parts of the computer age where you had to actually have kind of this thing that lived in your closet that powered your ability to use a computer. um there it was like this big kind of box, and it was hot, and it used up seemingly like a lot more energy in order to power like the computer infrastructure that lived in like people's houses, or if you were in school, similar type of thing. They had like a room that would like power all of that. um so imagine that, but at a hyperscale, and that is what essentially is living near people's homes, right? So just like that, it uses, water. Like it imagine something of that scale, how hot it gets. So the amount of water that is needed in order to power these data centers is tremendous, in the hundreds of millions of gallons of water for the most part. There are some systems that are being proposed where they're saying that they're using less water, but due to the lack of transparency and the lack of guardrails, even some of those solutions around like closed loops, it's self-reported by the company itself, and there's not a lot of policy considerations as to whether or not that self-reported information is reflected in any other way. And so also the other consideration when it comes to water is around the water infrastructure itself. So at the height of the Jackson water crisis, I was working with folks in a majority Black capital in the state of Mississippi, Jackson. And when they were facing their water crisis, it was because of neglect and, well, really disinvestment from the state in allowing for them to be able to replace and do operations and maintenance on the water system that was needed in order for them to not have to replace the water infrastructure. Now, that kind of pattern exists in many communities that have faced disinvestment. So if you have, for example, a data center that comes in to a community that's already faced disinvestment, the way that water infrastructure ages is by using it all the time. So if you're using, for example, hundreds of millions of gallons of water, that's going to age the infrastructure of that system much quicker than what just, me and you utilizing water for our everyday needs would be. And so when we looked into how much it would cost, for example, to replace the water infrastructure there, it was in the billions of dollars. And so imagine a community that, already hasn't gotten the resources it needs just for the operations and maintenance, and now they might need to replace their water infrastructure more quickly because of a data center. Air quality is another consideration. So, whether or not the data center is bringing their own energy that might be not renewable and clean, or if they're utilizing a transmission line that goes into the utilities, which might also be using fossil fuels, that will mean that there's more air pollution in the air. Depending on what kinds of system is used, some are much worse than others. I'll talk a little bit about, what happens when, for example, you use methane gas turbines. That is one model of what we're seeing. But most all of them have diesel backup generators. And so, regardless, there's going to be more fossil fuels that are going into communities when these data centers are being built. Energy in the grid. Um, if there's a data center that is utilizing the grid is built for a certain number of people to be able to utilize it. And so if, for example, you have like a hyperscale data center that now needs to utilize the grid, that changes everything. One of the reasons it changes everything is because me turning on a light in my room is very different than a hyperscale data center needing to have access to power to, power their data center, pretty much the entire day. And so we've already seen reports of brownouts and blackouts in different places because grids could not handle it. Now, in the places where a municipality has said, okay, well, we're going to, upgrade our grid. Once the conversation starts about a potential upgrade of a grid, there's modeling that has to happen, and that's very expensive. So the people who have to pay for the modeling or the upgrades to the grid are the current ratepayers. So that's why we're also seeing people say that there's an increase in their utility bills even if the data center has not been built, because they're the current ratepayers. And so people are correct when they're saying, okay, I don't, they're connecting increases in their bills, in this being an affordability crisis as well, to data centers, because it doesn't even have to be built yet. If the costs for even modeling are passed on to the current ratepayers, then that makes a big difference for everyday people who are just trying to like pay their bills. Um, and then it not being on the grid is not necessarily the answer either, as I'll go through a little bit later, because bringing your own energy, if it's going to be as hazardous or more hazardous, that's not going to be something that is helpful for the community. And there's fewer ways for people to be able to fight back. So the other point I will flag just for this presentation is the noise and the quality of life. I have talked to people who live near data centers, and it's interesting because sometimes people are like, oh, like the noise, is it really that bad? I will give you a very specific example. There's someone who I spoke with, and they shared, they're not even like right next to the data center, but they're close enough in proximity. They have been living in their community for almost a decade. And while they have been living, they moved there for, a quieter life. And they would get 8 to 9 hours of sleep. And now they are only getting 3 to 4 hours of sleep per night. And then they have to go to work the next morning with barely any sleep. Is impacting, of course, their health, because when you're not able to get a full night's sleep, that impact your sleep health impacts a lot of other things, from your brain function to how your body is able to fight off, other kinds of things that, health related concerns that show up. And you're just not able to have like a good quality of life. So it's not like this, the noise concern is not like this thing where it's like, okay, people are just saying like they hear something from time to time. It is literally disrupting how people are able to just be able to live their everyday lives. And they're hearing it 24 hours a day. And some people may ask, like, well, why don't they just move? Well, for a lot of people, especially if you like build, you have a home, and you invested your money somewhere, that's not necessarily an option for everyone to just be able to get up and like move to another place. So this is literally creating, problems for people who are basically stuck in a situation where they never asked to have that kind of thing brought into their community. And so that's why we're seeing so many people show up across the country in different ways to highlight the need for them to be a part of the process. So what we did, and this goes to, the importance of how the policy considerations need to come from the ground up. And we built out the first ever set of guiding principles for data center development at the height of when we were seeing this show up across the country. And the reason why we wanted to start from the community perspective was because we figured that for any kind of policy conversations that need to happen at the state, the local, and at the federal level, that it needed to be rooted, the North Star needed to come from the people who are most impacted. So we brought together and we had some local organizations who we worked with on the ground to make sure that when we were actually having this convening, it was anchored with community groups who were there, Young, Gifted, and Green, Memphis Communities Against Pollution, and several other groups. And we brought together over 100 different organizations, activist coalitions who were actively fighting data center fights at that time. And one of the things that people highlighted that was really helpful for them was that they were hearing for the first time from people in other places in the country. And now it might be harder for people to realize that there was a time where people didn't know that the data center fights were happening everywhere. But that's how early we were having these conversations. And so people were just excited to know that there were other people who were also fighting data centers in their communities. We consulted with the folks who actually pulled together the 1991 people of color convening as it related to EJ and environmental leadership to make sure, because that was where they developed the 17 principles of environmental justice. And we wanted our framework to be rooted in that ideology and the practice, the theory of practice that they were able to use to build something that has been such a long-lasting guiding way for us to be thinking about environmental justice. And so we brought folks together. We had a 2-day convening. It was in person as well as virtual. We had it at a historically Black college in South Memphis. And these are the principles that we developed together, and we were able to reach consensus with folks who were in the environmental justice movement, climate justice work, some environmental organizations, some folks from labor, housing, tenants' rights, education. There was a range of groups that came together, and the principles are that our health and environment are sacred, communities most affected must lead, jobs cannot justify the harm, accountability must be enforceable, we reject false solutions and fossil fuel dependency, that infrastructure must be community-led, interconnected harms require interconnected solutions, solidarity builds power, and that we walk our talk. Now, it was important for us to get that out early because we didn't want the momentum that had been built at the ground level to be lost in conversations that we knew were likely going to evolve over time when it came to data centers. Another part of our approach was to also build out public education documents. One of the reasons we wanted to make sure that people had material was because we saw at the beginning that the policy conversations were going to come from people feeling empowered at the local level to speak out about data center issues. So we wanted to make sure that people at the ground level felt empowered to talk about data center issues. And we know that a lot of our materials that we have developed have been helpful for different communities as they're trying to find a starting place with our Stop Dirty Data campaign to help them to be able to just talk about some of the things that they're concerned about in their communities. So our work and how we develop out our policy framework is always from the ground up. And so when we decided to take on the case in against XAI and MZX Tech, we started in Memphis. So that work came actually from working with our branch president there and then local community groups. And all of our work at the national level, we don't ever go into a community unless we feel like we have a good landscape of what's happening, what the gaps are, and then how we can, from a policy perspective, help to move forward the community wishes. Uh, and so this is our branch president in Memphis, and he was instrumental into making sure that we had eyes and ears on the ground at all times, showing up at all the city council meetings, showing up at all the different decision points as we were building out the case. So, what happened in Memphis? We first in May of last year, it was very clear to me that there were several different parties that were involved with allowing for XAI to operate and Elon Musk's data center to be able to operate in Memphis. But at that time, there was really only conversation around the health department potentially being involved and then the company. And I was like, but the utilities, they also play a role in allowing for, there being any hookups to like transmission lines or any utility use at all. And so there at that time, it was clear that we needed to make sure that people understood all the different people who were involved when it came to XAI operating without telling the community at all that it was bringing in all these methane gas turbines in order to power a supercomputer in a historically Black community. And so we tried to, before moving to litigation, we tried to get the county and the utilities and local elected officials to understand like the egregious nature of what was happening. And when it was clear that um, there wasn't going to be movement without there being policy intervention and legal intervention, we filed a 60-day notice of intent to sue. And so the reason we did that was because it was really important for the company to recognize that we knew that the Clean Air Act applied. They were operating methane gas turbines without a permit. And they claimed that they had some kind of exemption that did not exist. And so we were like, well, we need to file something. Under the law, you have to file this 60-day notice of intent first to give them a chance to like fix the problem. And then you can file a lawsuit if you need to. And then at the same time, so they started operating and then they had applied for a permit after they were already operating, which is not what you're supposed to be able to do under law. You have to wait until you get the permit, then you can operate. That's not what they did. So the health department issued them a permit for a minor source of pollution. Now, why is that important? Because if you're operating dozens of methane gas turbines, that is not a minor source. And so we challenged that as well. And we were like, this is not a minor source of pollution. When you issue a permit for like a major source, then you are able to get more more reporting, there's more safeguards that are in place. And so that's what we were pushing for at that time. And it was one of the first times that the health department had been challenged in that way. And so we also felt that that was really important for these local entities to understand that this is what they should be doing. This is the kind of rigor that should be going into every single decision because people's health and their environment and their future is on the line. And so when we filed the health department appeal with the board, it was really interesting because what we also learned at that time as well was that many of these entities did not have the technical expertise to be able to to take on these kinds of decisions. And one of the health board members actually said that this was the largest decision that they ever had to make. And I think that that is true for a lot of these places where they're building out these data centers. And so when we're thinking about policy considerations, I think that is also around ensuring that there's technical assistance that's available at the local and at the county and at the state level, because these decisions are being made whether or not the people who are making them have ever done anything like this in their life before. And many of them are citizen boards, and they're like people, everyday people who are now all of a sudden making a decision about whether or not $1 billion tech company is able to operate in their community or not. So while all of that was happening, XAI, MZX Tech, they decided to essentially do virtually the exact same thing that they did in South Memphis, and to take that over to South Haven, Mississippi. And so Gordon Jackson, so this is also like a example of the type of individual who we work with in order to make sure that our policy considerations are rooted at the ground level. And we also work with the president in the DeSoto County branch. But we recognized what was happening in South Memphis, and we're like, okay, we need to make sure that people are prepared, ready to go when it comes to South Haven. And so having seen how Elon Musk, XAI and MZ Tech had operated in South Memphis, it allowed for people to understand what was needed whenever they came across the state line. And in addition to that, what we were also, seeing is that people in Memphis understood that even though this fight was in Mississippi, the airshed for who was going to be impacted was also going to impact them still because of how close it was in the greater Memphis area. And so people were still concerned in showing up from Memphis, Tennessee, and other parts of Tennessee. They were showing up in Mississippi as well for different like policy intervention points. So in October, we began really organizing folks. In February of this year, that's when there was the first community hearing. Folks showed up. We had over 200 people who showed up to the hearing, the community hearing. And that was led by the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality. Um, and leading with like the organizing and mobilization kind of strategy ensured that when the state had this hearing, that it was going to be really challenging for them to say that people didn't care about this, and also that, this is something that people wanted. They had to actually move the location because the first location wasn't going to hold all the people who were going to be there. And every single person who showed up said no to the permit. And I think that that's really powerful because, again, this is like a permit hearing, and you had over 200 people showing up to a permit hearing in South Haven, Mississippi. So we also filed a notice of intent to sue then in February as well, because again, they basically did the exact same thing that they did in South Memphis. And so we had to start that process for the 60 days. And then in March, we saw a different kind of policy intervention that was needed differently than we had. What that difference was that the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality, so in Tennessee, it was the Shelby County Health Department who was the policy body who oversaw the permit. In Mississippi is the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality. They shared out a notice about the board actually moving forward with a ruling. So we weren't really sure what exactly they were going to be deciding because it had only been a couple weeks since the hearing had happened in South Haven. And by law, they have to consider every single comment. So they had at least 200 comments. If not, they had a ton of comments that they had to go through, and they have to actually go through every single comment, respond to every single comment, and that takes time. So within a couple weeks, we're like, surely that cannot be them making a decision about the permit because it's not enough time. Well, then the Saturday before the hearing, we found out that that was what they planned to do. So on a Saturday, they sent us their responses, and I'm using air quotes, but we felt they were very deficient to the comments that, our groups and that community members had shared as it related to XAI and MZX Tech operating in South Haven. And then it which was a Tuesday. And I'm bringing that date up because it's another policy intervention piece that they were planning to actually move forward with the final decision on the permit on that day. So on that Saturday, in talking with our state conference leadership and our branch leadership, we also found out that that Tuesday, which was in one business day after getting it that Saturday, was election day in Mississippi. So they were basically having people choose between their civic duty, and it also was in Jackson, Mississippi, which was over 200 miles away, between their civic duty to vote that day or to show up at 9 a.m. over 200 miles away in Jackson to give comment as it related to the final decision for this permit. So we issued an emergency letter to the Secretary of State, to MDEQ, and several entities saying, like, you shouldn't be, this, seems to be a concern for full and fair participation on an election day for people's civic engagement to move forward with this decision on that day. And part of our strategy too was just to amplify that this is the kind of, policy strategies that are being utilized by some of these entities to try to get these data centers moving as quickly as possible. They still decided to move forward with it that day, but I think that everyone felt like at that point, they clearly had a plan. And so we decided to appeal the permit. So we're now awaiting our date for appealing that. And then we filed our complaint. And so now we have our first legal complaint against Elon Musk XAI and MZX Tech in South Haven, Mississippi, as a part of our policy intervention that came from the community and ground up that has been built, over a year progress of ensuring that people understand like all the different levers when it comes to policy intervention. The other ways that we're also engaging in policy intervention is by helping people to understand like what other kinds of overreach are happening. So this is a picture of some of the work that we were doing in Indiana. There was federal overreach by the Army Corps there to basically say that because there was no dredging that was happening when there was going to be construction on a transmission line, that the state did not have to move forward with a community public hearing for a data center build out that was happening in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so part of that was, one, helping people to understand, that we believe that that was federal overreach, but helping people to understand what are some of the things that they could do in that situation, right? But part of what, we also wanted to flag for people is that there's also just a consideration of the fact that we have to make sure that at the local and at the state level that you have willing bodies to move forward with like those transparency and public education and public participation and engagement pieces that are necessary, because Indiana could have just done the hearing, even if they didn't have to. They were going to be mandated, but then they basically chose not to have a public hearing on construction that was going to be on protected wetlands. And so that helped to inform people about decisions that they could make when it comes to who is going to represent them moving forward. We also have been involved in issues as it relates to tariff conversations at the state level. So in Wisconsin, earlier this year, we helped to get over 40, I think about 43 national and state organizations to sign on to support a public service commission intervention that would basically allow for there to be tariffs in place to kind of serve as like a community benefit ordinance at the state level, so that anytime that there was going to be a data center build out in the state, that they had to meet certain requirements in order to build anywhere. And I think that that's also really important. Of course, at the hyperlocal level is important, but it's also important at the state level for in the places where you can do that, to think creatively about how states can also ensure that they are protecting communities. And the last thing I'll highlight is we published a report, which was a response to a report that was done in Prince George's County. This report was called the People's Report. And it was a policy intervention because the individuals who were part of the task force were all super pro data centers, and they did not actually have any community. Their summary of community engagement did not reflect what the community was actually saying. So this is also another way, especially at like a university, we work very closely with many universities to build this out, to highlight the gaps in the analysis that we were seeing. And it helped, and it's been helping to push back the decisions at the county level as it relates to data center build out in Prince George's County. And we felt that that was the right intervention for us because a lot of the mobilization work had already happened. So this is our last page, and it's just the recommendations that we built out earlier this year as it relates to data center build outs. Permitting reform, environmental protections are needed, more transparency and fiscal accountability, continuing to make sure that we have people power and mobilization, that we need to continue tracking projects and data center mapping, and that leadership development and representation are more critical than ever. And with the Supreme Court decision that came out yesterday, is making sure that democracy is really at the center of all the decisions when it comes to data center build out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abre. You can't hear it, but there's some claps in the other room too. I really appreciate it. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and moderate a little bit of a discussion now over the next 10 to 15 minutes. If you have questions, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A. And in the meantime, while you're thinking of those questions, I'm going to go ahead and exercise moderator's privilege here and ask a question of my own. So you've talked about some of the community level, state level, and even federal level policy loopholes that allow for these unexpected and unethical data center buildouts. You've also talked about the parallels that exist between the AI boom and previous examples of fossil fuel development that we've seen. So in a lot of ways, we've seen this unfortunate play before, but we also have a playbook for it, I think. And so I was wondering if you could describe some of the federal level policies, especially those that have already been designed to mitigate the harms of the fossil fuel industry, and how they could be adapted to protect communities from these data center impacts. Second part to that question would be, in your experience, and among the folks you've talked to who are federal level employees and policymakers, who's thinking about this? Who's kind of leading the charge when it comes to revamping those policies for the years ahead?
Yeah. Well, I will say this, NEPA is, I'd say the bedrock of when we think about environmental policy and having an umbrella. And we've seen the rollback of how NEPA has been able to be deployed over, since the change in administration and Congress shifting its composition as well. But there's a lot of energy around trying to get to strengthen NEPA and to strengthen some of the permitting reform that's needed at the federal level. I would say even more, visionary than just like the protections that are already there because it's NEPA. I think that, we need to keep the Clean Air Act, we need to keep the Clean Water Act, we need to keep what we have. But there also have been, times in the past where we got really close to looking at more comprehensive legislation, like environmental justice for all, which Congressman McEachin and others really championed in the past, because when it comes to data center issues, it is about utilizing the environmental legislation and, protections that we have, but it's also about looking at the intersection of what that means for civil rights. And Title VI has been completely gutted in a number of ways. And that would allow for there to be a private right of action under Title VI. And that's been something that people have been sharing for a number of years. Even when I first started litigating, like there is a need. And I think that now more than ever, we need to have comprehensive legislation that takes into account, of course, the environmental protections, but also ensuring that people on the ground who are feeling the harms, that they're able to actually move forward with cases that are reflective of the reality and the cumulative concerns that they have seen for a number of years. And as far as who's kind of championing many of these concerns, so there are several working groups that exist, behind the scenes with different members of Congress on the Senate and on the House side. There have been some folks who have been more public, about calling for moratoriums, and then there's some folks who have pushed forward some bills around transparency. And then there are also, as late as last week, there was a call for an investigation, on the Hill as it related to XAI and similar types of build outs, on the Senate side as well. And so I think we're starting to see more creative interventions on Capitol Hill. But I think that what we're going to need to see, between now and the end of the year, quite frankly, is, people really being willing to step out there in a line, in a united effort on Capitol Hill to make sure that the things that are being introduced, that there's alignment that would allow for us to maybe move forward with something that's comprehensive in nature.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I'm glad to see you all doing this important work quickly because it's a rapidly developing space. All right, so we've got a couple questions here that I think would make sense to answer live. So someone asks, what is the biggest misconception you see around data center development in the media?
I think that it is inevitable, that it's going to happen, and that, really what we should be looking at are what are the solutions for it being built, in these same places potentially, as opposed to the conversation about whether or not the number and the scale is actually needed. So I think that there's like that common misconception. And I think the other misconception that I think is a concern, like, well, that we are seeing is it's a gap of where they're putting community-led efforts as not being connected to the policy conversations. And so it's like you'll see people who are talking about policy conversations who are not really connected to communities. And so when they're talking about policy solutions, is also disconnected from what
Mhm.
people are calling for. And is also, quite frankly, where I'm seeing the biggest disconnect.
Yeah. I'm so happy to see the chat is popping off here, so we'll try to get to all of these in time. Someone here at NC's asks, Are there any examples of hyperscale data centers that operate well by your assessment or have been acting more responsibly?
I will say that there are some newer operators who, at least on paper, seem to recognize the moment that we're in, and that they need to address water and energy, and air pollution. And as far as operating responsibly, I don't know if I'd go that quite that far yet, but I will say that they are at least recognizing that they have to address it in their, in their materials and how they're talking to people. And I think that that to me is, a win from the community perspective because, at the beginning of this boom, like that was not the conversation. The conversation was like jobs, 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 which we know that is not really what is happening. It's not like hundreds of jobs or thousands of jobs that are being offered, and that some of these companies are realizing like, oh, these are the concerns that people have. And so we need to at least try to address that in what we are sharing with people on at the ground. And it's mostly, I'd say, like middle size data center operators who are trying to like find their way into these conversations.
Yeah, that's heartening. No one acting responsibly yet, but at least listening. Um, in a kind of similar vein, someone asked, is there a pattern of these large tech companies seeking to build out data centers in places that are less equipped to understand the potential impacts?
Yes.
Short answer, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think, and that was why early in our campaign, we wanted to make sure that we put out materials and things that resonated with everyday people. I think that, when it comes to a lot, what I feel like is a lesson learned from some of the climate and environmental conversations that we've seen in the past is that there's a lot of like really technical language that leaves people feeling like they can't engage in what's happening. And I think that, what we're seeing now is people do feel empowered because, groups like ours and our partners have tried to make sure that the language is at a level that people understand what's actually happening. Because a lot, like what's actually happening, it doesn't have to be that complicated. We can talk about things in ways of how we talk to each other. And so I think that that was the initial goal. And I know that many of these companies are shocked because they are showing up in these places and people are asking questions and really good ones because they feel more empowered to, want to have that level of transparency that some of these companies were hoping that they would be able to have backroom deals and talk to just a few people and move forward without having to bring everybody in.
Yep. Hoping there wouldn't be a fight.
Yeah.
We've got two great questions here in just a little bit of time. So there's a question from Altia Marks and Preeti M, and I'm going to ask them a little bit out of order so we can end on the theoretical one. But Preeti asks, how do we educate others on data center harms and encourage people to exploit AI harms with the existing massive push for AI use? Are there policies that could possibly accomplish this?
Yeah. And I guess this question is more getting at tying in the infrastructure to like the use of like AI, like responsible AI. I think that what would allow for us to do that a little bit better is for people to take the approach of, quite frankly, what environmental justice, that kind of movement work has done since its beginning. One of our principles, as you saw on the screen, was interconnected harms require interconnected solutions. And I think that is helping people to understand that, the concerns that people have around like, algorithmic bias, or surveillance, or, security more generally, that those things that are feeding the need for there to be AI in the first place, is powered by this infrastructure that is also harming people on the back end. And so I think that there's like a conversation around like responsibly moving forward with technology that does not harm people, but then always connecting it back to the actual infrastructure. And I think that as long as people don't feel like when they're having a conversation around the actual AI, that it has to somehow be devoid of the infrastructure, that will allow for us to move forward in lockstep and not have people feel like they have to have one conversation in one space and then another conversation with people who aren't thinking necessarily about like the infrastructure.
I thought you also made a great point earlier about the misconception that this is inevitable. If
Yes.
we reject that idea, then we have a little more time and space to move ethically.
Yeah.
All right, Altia, thanks for writing a great question to see us out. So we're at a data center here. I know people could be tuning in from across campus or across communities, but I think we spend a lot of time thinking about this too. So Altia writes, thank you so much for sharing your experience and conveying the experiences of folks in these communities. I'm a data scientist who is grappling with how to responsibly incorporate, select generative AI tools in my environmental data science workflows, and writing up responsible AI lab policy that aligns with the values and motivations of our work. Can you suggest any resources that evaluates how the various corporate AI companies are being socially and environmentally responsible from your perspective? That's a good question. Something that a concerned data scientist could use to be selective in the products they use.
Well, that is a great question because I will me, and that's something that we are actively considering, what are the next steps for that, and something that can be independently sourced, and also led by communities so that there can be metrics that, are not built by the company themselves, but built by the people who would have to feel the impacts of the decisions. And so that's something I think that, this boom has happened so quickly that a lot of what's happening is like happening in real time. And some of the messaging and the way that at the beginning we saw the narrative like really being disconnected from AI infrastructure, data center infrastructure was because of the fact that it was moving very quickly. And then the companies were able to share a very specific narrative. But I think that we have finally reached a point where people are questioning it. And we're hoping that, the individuals who can also help in thinking through ensuring that we have clear metrics for building that out, that we can all come together because that's something that we're actively working on behind the scenes as well.
And I will be eager to see the results of that. That's going to be great. All right, well, I'm just going to see us out with a few announcements here, and then we'll pause and hopefully everyone can give you a virtual hand. So thanks so much, everyone, for tuning into this seminar. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. For those who are not familiar with NCs, we are associated with UC Santa Barbara, based downtown. Like Ben said, you can reach us at various places online and also sign up for the newsletter. Coming up, we've got a couple of exciting talks from folks in our network. So we have a talk by Dr. Rachel King on Wednesday, May 6th from 6:30 to 7:30 at the Fig Mountain Brewery. She'll be talking about tuning into nature and the various data science sources we can use to do that. Next up in the seminar series, we'll hear from Dr. Cesar Estlin, who will be telling us more about yesterday's tomorrow. That'll be on Wednesday, May 27th from noon to 1. And then finally, Patricia Balvanera will see us out with this spring seminar series on Thursday, June 11th, noon to 1. So we hope that you all can join us for that. Thanks so much, Abre. Let's give her a round of hand wherever you are in the world. It was really a pleasure to meet you and hear from you. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.